Well, hello there, Ambush. And welcome to this episode of the Desert Tiger Podcast here with me, your host, Colton G. And today on the show, we are joined by author Martin Popoff as we talk about his new book, Limelight, Rush in the 80's. Yes, prestigious Canadian journalist, critic, and author Martin Popoff is joining us here today. He is the author of over 90 books. He was the co-founder of Brave Words and Bloody Knuckles, a magazine on heavy metal which ran for 15 years. And well, Martin also happens to be one of the premier researchers on the group Rush. He wrote their 2003 authorized biography, Contents Under Pressure. He was one of the researchers on the critically acclaimed documentary on the group Beyond the Lighted Stage. And now Martin is taking you further into the world of Rush than ever before. It all started with the first novel in this series, Anthem, Rush in the 70's, and now it is time for the release for the second part of this series, Limelight, Rush in the 80's, and we're going to dive into what that world looked like. The band was coming off of Hemispheres, an album that did very well, but was incredibly taxing on the group. The band also started to use synthesizers a lot more going into the 80's. So how did that affect their sound? How did changing producers affect things for the band? And as well, the 80's were the beginning of MTV, the music video era. So how is it for Rush sort of going into that new territory as well? We're going to talk about all of these things, and it's all just a brushing of the surface of what is included inside of Limelight, and it's all brought to you today by DesertTigerMerch.com, because that's where you go. That's where you go to grab yourself something to represent the show everywhere you go. And now I believe it is time that we jumped into this conversation with acclaimed author Martin Popoff.
The Desert Tiger Podcast.
Hey, how are you, Colton?
I am fantastic. How are you doing, Martin?
Good. Okay, so what are we talking about? Rush?
No, I would love to do that.
Okay, sure, let's do it.
All right. Well, I mean, today we're bringing us together to talk about your second book in this latest collection of Rush written material that you have graced this world with. This is Limelight, Rush in the 80's, your first book, Anthem, Rush in the 70's, released earlier this year. You have another one coming out in 2021. So, I mean, for some of the audience that maybe doesn't know, you're pretty much one of the premier researchers, not only in rock music, metal music, but in Rush history. You've also released 3 books prior to this. So what brought in this new reiteration of Rush literature?
Well, so the first book was called Contents Under Pressure, and that goes back to 2003. And it was an authorized official Rush biography, but it was pretty short. It was a full color book throughout, but only, I think, 60-something thousand words. And then, I did an illustrated history, which was a different thing. And then I did an album by album, which is a really weird format where I just got a bunch of Rush fans, as famous as possible. And we just kind of went through every studio album Q&A. And I did 5 books like that on different bands. But then what happened was I also worked on the Rush movie, Beyond the Lighted Stage. And, I was there full time for 9 months on that thing at the front end at the research and writing team end of it. And I would also transcribe a lot of those interviews. So one day I just thought, years later, after the movie was long and gone, I just thought, why don't I just approach Scott and Sam and see if, if I could make a deal with them to basically use what we didn't use in the movie, because I knew there was so much great footage, and do a book thing. So this is even before I even went back to ECW and said, let's do this project. So essentially that was a good way to get a bunch of great Rush stuff. And then I thought, okay, so I'm going to update the official one because it's super old. I'm going to do a lot of analyzing as well, because I did these 2 books for Voyager Press, who I also did 2 Rush books for, one on Led Zeppelin, one on Clash, where I had to write like 500 words on every single song they ever did. So that I was inspired by that as well. So I thought, okay, outside press, all of this great material, update on the old book, a lot of analysis, just throw everything but the kitchen sink at it. And I started writing it, and the original plan was we were going to have 1 massive book, but then I quickly realized we had 3. So I thought, okay, let's break it up in these different ways. And that's why we've got, the first book at however many pages it is. I think it's in the 300 range, and this one's a little bit less. This one's maybe 260, something like that. But the last one is actually quite a bit longer. I think it's more like 350 or 400. So essentially, a trilogy came out of the whole thing, and hopefully I'm done with Rush now, finally.
Well, I mean, you've given various different perspectives, and like you said, you did do Contents Under Pressure, but there was only so much depth that gave us. So this is definitely giving the fans of the band, which does have a very strong cult following, a much more in-depth and a much more from the band's perspective and a lot of the people who are around the band.
Definitely. There's a lot. I mean, people have said almost like it reads like an oral history. I try to stay more or less out of it. I have no ego in this at all. I don't really care to, my opinions and analysis are in there, but I definitely don't go overboard. So yeah, it's definitely in their words, which is cool. That's what I want to bring to any rock book I do. I mean, I really want to be able to bring something new to the table and not just have it being, my opinion or all like, the outside press. Granted, Rush has done a lot of press over the years, but, some of that is in here. But basically, I wanted to make sure it brought something new to the table. Otherwise, I wouldn't have done it.
Okay, well, let's get into some of the content of Limelight here. So, of course, it finds us moving out of the 80s, or moving into the 80s, out of the 70s, where 79 was definitely a recessionary year for the music industry. Things didn't look so great, and the band themselves, yes, they were coming out of the studio, and their first album that kicks off the decade is right at the beginning of 80, but they're also coming off of Hemispheres, a very well-regarded album, but one that was definitely trying for the band. So where does the band find themselves moving into this new era?
Well, I think they've kind of decided that, like they say, Hemispheres was the album that almost broke the camel's back. So the idea was that they were going to try to write some shorter songs. Neil's writing a little more universal, things that everybody thinks about, more mankind, rather than, Greek mythology or sci-fi or whatever. But it's still a pretty proggy album. It's not a very long album, which is kind of odd, but it still has fairly long songs, but they aren't as long as like a whole side. So it's not a concept or a half concept album like Hemispheres is and like 2112 is. They're both kind of half concept albums, right? And then they ended up having a hit single at the same time with The Spirit of Radio, which was a pretty big hit. It catapulted them. It set them up for the really big album, which was Moving Pictures.
So at this time, too, Rush is very much out on the road. They're touring like just as hard as pretty much any other band that's out there. They're putting a lot of money into their stage presence, and finally with Moving Pictures as well, they're finally starting to get to that level where they're headlining and they're touring. And how did that sort of affect everything?
Yeah, at this point, they are pretty much headliners. No more, having to deal with Aerosmith or Kiss or whatever. Or Uriah Heep, in the early years, who were, by the way, quite good to them. I'm a big Heep fan as well, but they basically they are headliners. They're moving in, from the B City hockey barns into the A City hockey barns, as it were, right? Playing to 16,000 people, I suppose. Well, I mean, definitely as moving pictures is happening. And they're a headliner and they never look back. They never become not a headliner again. And yeah, they were pretty good at, this generosity towards the fans of really actually reinvesting a lot of their money in the show. So very quickly, with not a lot of people really noticing or giving them credit for this, but very quickly they became a band that actually had one of the bigger shows eventually, with a lot of technology and stuff. They added a lot of video and stuff. They were pioneers for that. But yeah, so at this point, they're essentially a headliner act, and they've got backup bands. And then as you move even further forward into the 90s and stuff, they eventually get to an evening with Rush where they're playing 3 hours with no backup band, right? But at this point, they're basically, the it band, from moving pictures into Signals. They're essentially a pretty darn big band, as big as any of those hardworking, upper medium tier bands. They aren't the Rolling Stones or anything like that, but they're a fairly popular band at this point.
Okay, so of course you mentioned that the group is sort of transitioning sounds as well. They were the pioneers of progressive metal, you have said in the past, and now they're sort of morphing more into progressive rock, almost a pop sound with the introduction of keyboards throughout the 80s. What brought on of this new technology throughout this decade?
I think they're just creatively inquisitive, and they do like music. They're music fans, so they're looking at what's new. As time goes on, so this is Getty adopting the keyboard technology, and it starts really small and it gets bigger and bigger. It never gets too incredibly big or even a huge part of their sound. Well, on record it does, not particularly on stage, but they're just liking all these new toys and these new gizmos, and they are trying to move forward. They move away from Terry Brown into Peter Henderson and Peter Collins, and by the time you get to Power Windows and Hold Your Fire, yeah, Neil's got electronic drums going. He's hitting the syn drums and all this, and the keyboard sounds are very stabby. They're quite loud and braying by this point, where they kind of, mixed in nicer on Signals. I thought it had more of an analog sort of sound, but by this point they're doing all this, and I'm not crazy about these albums, and I do question. I don't think they dated as well as the 70s stuff or even Moving Pictures or Signals. So I think they kind of went overboard. When you're early adopters of something, you can sometimes get burned, right? I mean, anybody who spent tons of money on their early computers or their early video games or any of that stuff, right? As things progress, it turns out to be maybe you spent too much money on it, right? Or but on these records, it's a little bit like they dove in both feet first, 6 feet first, whatever, into these sounds. And I don't think Hold Your Fire and Power Windows particularly hold up that well.
Oh, absolutely. And part of that is the transition and the changing of producers, possibly, where moving from the trusted Terry Brown and making the decision to possibly find a new influence. But what did the changes in producer between Terry Brown and then the small stopgap at Peter Henderson into Peter Collins?
Yeah, so the idea there is that, Peter Henderson, first of all, that was a letdown because Steve Lillywhite had stood them up. They were supposed to work with him. And then to their horror, they found Peter Henderson, wasn't particularly opinionated in giving them much direction. And they wanted a lot of direction because they're smart guys. They want other smart guys in the room. They don't mind being told no to. They'll have a healthy debate about it. But they really didn't get a lot out of them in terms of the creative. So they were a little disappointed with that. And that album was made in freezing cold, and it took a long, long time. But you move on to Peter Collins, and here, he's called Mr. Big, right? So he is opinionated, and he there are certain things about Rush he didn't like, and they would cede to his wishes sometimes, and he would get his way, and he would bring this English new wave sensibility to the band. And they still look back on those albums fondly. I mean, they don't look back on them as badly as a curmudgeonly old 70s headbanging fan would. They thought they were pretty good. But, the other curious thing about the Rush guys is that they always admit that they could have made mistakes along the way too. So sometimes, they look back on these eras and think, oh, we made mistakes, and other times they sort of stand up for these records. But so essentially, he was bringing this aesthetic that I suppose he talked them into, or they were willingly into it. This sort of tight in the middle, kind of mid-rangey, trebly, screechy sort of sound that's missing a lot of bass, and it's not very analog, and it doesn't have much high end except for toppiness on even bass guitars for that matter, and guitars and snappy, tight snare drums and all that kind of thing, right? So that's what you get off of those two records. And then, of course, they move on to Rupert Hine, another curious sort of English figure. That's an odd choice. And things don't really change particularly much. I mean, they do talk about that last record, Presto, as being more of a songwriter record, a singing record. I guess Geddy's really toning down the singing somewhat progressively over time. But really, I don't think the sound is all that much bigger. And I think the keyboards are still sort of there. It's still kind of tiny sounding, right? So, I'm not a big fan of that record all that much either. And then they kind of do the same thing with Roll the Bones again. But so that's your sort of producer throughput. I mean, again, I guess the recap is that they want creative people in the room because they want healthy discussion.
For sure, and you would think that they took on a few producers that were very opinionated about Rush and had their opinions about Rush, and even with Henderson saying that he wasn't a very big fan of Geddy Lee's vocals, but then when he gets in the studio has not a whole lot to say for him.
Yeah, and Peter Collins, I think, said kind of the same thing. And so, Rush is happy with someone not coming from that progressive handlebar mustache, progressive metal 70s thing, because they do want a fresh look at things. It's almost like Rush is subliminally saying, make us not sound like Rush. Give us something different to do here. And that's them just being creatively fearless and moving forward.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. And you have to do that as a musician, and sometimes those albums are collections of who these individuals are at these times too. Yep.
And their videos reflect that, and their wardrobe and their haircuts and everything reflect a kind of an embracing of the 80s, for better or worse. And, I think the verdict is still out. Maybe the 80s will be cool once again at some point, but it so far hasn't happened, I don't think, along the way. The 70s became cool again, but I'm not sure. I guess the 80s still has to have its time. Like maybe in 20 years, these will be looked at as the absolute coolest records Rush ever did.
Mm-hmm. There's small 80s influences making their way into some forms of music right now, but we'll see exactly how far they go.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
So you mentioned the music videos, and the 80s was definitely the birth of MTV in that generation, and you also mentioned that the band, through numerous ways, either through the keyboards or with stage presence, were definitely jumping feet first in with a lot of things. Do you feel that music videos they also tackled this way?
Yeah, and I think they did a pretty good job of it. I mean, they do have some embarrassing things and some early uses of technology that don't look so great now. But, it was pretty cool that Rush got in with the videos pretty early on, and they got played a lot, especially up here in Canada, because we had our own MTV up here called Much Music, which was just as powerful in Canada as to Canadians as much, or MTV was in the States, right?
Yes.
Rush being Canadian, I mean, I'm sure they got much more play up here, but Rush did well in the States too. That's the other thing. I mean, they just went to the States and just hammered on the States all the time. I mean, I swear, like many Rush fans probably think they're an American band, although Rush fans are pretty knowledgeable about things too, right? But no, I think getting in on the videos and putting a lot of sweat ethic into them has turned out some pretty iconic video work. And so they got their piece of the pie. They got their piece of the promotional action out of videos. It wasn't that they missed an opportunity there. They got in and took advantage of that opportunity.
Okay, for sure. You mentioned that maybe some of you 80s or 70s metalheads who had adopted the band early maybe were getting frustrated with some of the new albums. Maybe sales were being affected. Was part of that touring schedule through the United States part of what helped keep the band afloat, help them keep successful?
Absolutely, or it actually is the success in a way. I mean, literally, Rush has a little bit of a different business model. It's not terribly different, but basically Rush, because they put so much into their show and they were so good live and they had the video and they had all sorts of stuff to keep people entertained, they quietly sold lots and lots and lots of tickets even when their record sales were going down. So they did quite well out there. So it almost was their living playing live, right? Because the records, were falling into that going gold situation in the States, whereas before it was multi-platinum and platinum. It had dropped off. You were getting, every one of these was going gold, which is pretty incredible, even still. I mean, when bands look back, they certainly once physical product went away, bands would look back longingly at the days when they could have a gold record, right? But Rush was definitely doing that all the time. So you're right. You make a good point. But yeah, it's almost like it's not that the live work, the touring helped the success. It was the success, essentially. It was more the success. And, because really even success in terms of being like well regarded and talked about, Rush didn't have that in the 80s particularly. They weren't that well regarded and they weren't that talked about.
Mm-hmm. For sure. Definitely that cult band sort of following that we spoke about earlier.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So I want to also speak just about the songwriting and one of what is considered Rush's biggest songs in Tom Sawyer. And of course, this song had a little bit of inspiration from a Canadian poet who the band found through tour mates Max Webster, P. Du Bois. So let's talk a little bit about Louis the Lawyer, Tom Sawyer.
Yeah, so Pi Du Bois is the lyricist for Max Webster. I mean, he's basically the fifth member of the band. Hang on, 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah, something like that. He's either sixth or fifth. Anyways, he wrote basically about, I would say, 75% of all the lyrics for Max Webster. He's a good buddy of mine. I talk to him all the time. But he and he was always on tour with them anyway. So it's not exactly like they found him or discovered him. He was just always there. They knew him as much as everybody else. He's just a buddy of the band, right? Because Max Webster is supporting Rush on all those early tours. So they're all buddies. They're all on the same record label, same management. They're all from Toronto. So essentially, it just turned out one day that Pi had a bunch of his lyrics and Neil was there. I think this might have been at the Battle Scar session, which is a song that Rush and Max Webster literally play together, and it's on a Max Webster album, right? Their last album, Universal Juveniles. And basically, what are you working on? Oh, I got this. Oh, maybe we can collaborate or whatever. And so it turned out to be the first of, I think it's 4, 5, or 6 songs, maybe 4-ish, 5-ish, I can't remember. But essentially, there's this little handful of songs through the Rush catalog that are lyrics by Neil and Pi combined, right? A co-credit, and essentially that has to happen. I'm realizing more so why now, because I'm kind of helping Pi. We're possibly going to put together like a book of his poetry, his non-lyrics. But so I'm kind of editing him right now, and I see what that process is like. It's exactly how Neil told me it was like. It's like you get a whole bunch of stuff, and it's just disparate lines here or there or whatever, and you have to really hammer it into shape. So Neil would have had to do quite a rewrite job and an edit job to turn that into a song, notwithstanding the fact that now you got to, give it to a singer to sing, and it's got to be in a rock and roll album, right? So there's a lot of work that has to go into it. And so they co-wrote, what turned out to be Rush's biggest song, which is really cool.
Absolutely. Wow, we've covered quite a few stories through this 80s journey, but this is only a cover. There's so much more inside of Limelight, inside of Anthem, and I'm, like you said, inside of Driven, which is coming up, Rush in the 90s in the end.
Yeah, that's like I say, the longest of all these books, and because it does cover 25 years, right? And obviously some unfortunate tragedies and Neil dying. We just got to change that right at the end because that book's been written for a long, long time. So yeah, that one covers a lot of different records and the tours and the records spreading out and a lot of stuff that happens. But this 80s one is well, it's different from the 70s one because the 70s had a big, long lead up because Rush essentially, they were a band from 69 to 74 without an album out, right? I mean, 74 is when they really, really start, but they went a long time early. So that one has a lot of the childhood sort of stuff in it, teen years mostly. But then Limelight is, them just going to work and just becoming, big, huge rock stars, basically.
The growth of the band and throughout, and then of course Driven, the closing chapter, comes out next year in 2021.
Yep, absolutely, yeah. And I've got all these, basically these are all, I just actually bought another batch of 50 Anthem and 50 Limelight. So I basically at martinpopoff.com, I sign these and send them out, and I actually just recently got some Limelight and Anthem bookmarks. So those are going in the orders that I'm filling right now. So yeah, those are, and there's PayPal buttons and everything there. But basically any of my books, I basically buy a supply of them and sign them and ship them out from the office.
Hey, well, if anybody wants one of those personally signed by the author, you know where to find it, martinpopoff.com.
Absolutely, yep.
All right. Well, Martin, a book with P. Dubois coming out in the future, another book with Rush. You run your own podcast shipping out all these books. What else do you possibly have going on in the future?
Well, the podcast stuff, I'm working on a book on Angel right now. Tomorrow I received Thin Lizzy, a visual biography. I've also got a Blue Oyster Cult visual biography that's recent. But no, just that other Rush one. I've got a sweet book that I've kind of got. I'm about 80% done. Going on a lot of shows. Been going on Pete Pardo's A Sea of Tranquility a lot. But yeah, the History in 5 Songs with Martin Popoff podcast. I do that every single week. I'm up to 70 episodes of that. So yeah, just toiling away at that stuff. I mean, it might seem like a lot of output, but I'm one of the few guys that, writing books is the full-time job, right? It's most people don't have this as their full-time job. And even more so, even before when I was more of a well-rounded rock journalist guy, there used to be 5 magazines and a lot of print and a lot of website stuff and liner notes and all that sort of thing. But most of that has fallen away with the changes in the music business. So yeah, it's basically books all the time. So it looks like a lot of output, but it's not really that much work.
Hey, well, you're still continuing to not only give those who grew up with these bands a further look into the world, you're allowing people of my generation and even younger the ability to see into what the world of these bands was like, and we appreciate you for that.
Cool, thank you. Yeah, it's cool. I mean, it's great when newer generations I discover all this old stuff because I basically, believe me, I just write about a lot of really old bands.
Well, hey, I mean, if it pays the bills, nothing wrong with that.
No, it eventually won't pay the bills because all of us will be dying off. All the people who care about this music, slowly, even if there are young people coming on, it's still going to decline, obviously, always, right?
Very true. Yeah. Very true. And the industry changes just like the music industry continues to as well.
Yeah, for sure.
All right, Martin, I want to thank you so much for joining us here today to tell us about Limelight, Rush in the 80s, to take us behind a few of the stories and, well, give us a little bit more insight into yourself.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. This has been fun.
Oh, yes, it has truly been a blast. And I hope that you, the ambush, feels the same way. I hope you enjoyed this conversation here with Martin Popoff. And of course, it was only a dusting of the surface of the world of Rush in the 80s, and you can find out so much more in Martin's new book, Limelight, Rush in the 80s. You can find it right now at martinpopoff.com. Get yourself a signed copy while you're there. You can also get a copy of Anthem, Rush in the 70s, the first book in this new collection. And both of those can hold you over until 2021 when Driven, Rush in the 90s and Beyond drops then, and hopefully we are lucky enough that Martin Popoff has the ability to join us again. But that is in the future. And as of right now, it's time to give out these final Roaring Desert Tiger thank yous. And we're going to start it off with a roaring DTP thank you to Martin Popoff for joining us here today to take us into the world of Rush in the 80s. And I also have to thank the person who helped set it all up, and that is the wonderfully talented Susanna Ames over at ECW Press. Last but not least, the final roaring DTP thank you goes to you, the loyal, dedicated Ambush, for tuning into this episode of the podcast, for continuing to tune into episodes of the podcast as we shift into 2 episodes a week here into what is year 4 of Desert Tiger. We love you for it. If you haven't joined up with the Ambush yet, it is so easy. All you have to do is hit subscribe on the podcast service you are using right now. You can also help the show grow by giving us a big old 5-star review. You can share this episode with your friends, your family, heck, maybe even your enemies. And you can also check out DesertTigerMerch.com. Alright, this Friday, October the 30th, 2020, on the podcast, we are joined by Nevis. We speak to her about her self-titled debut EP and the singles, the road that has led her to this point. But until then, you know what it is. You know what I want you to do. I want you to go out there and find your oasis, to find your mountaintop, to find the thing that makes your heart sing to its fullest glory and capacity. Find that thing, craft it, hone it, grow with it. And then once you grow with it, you let that roar out across that canyon, out across that waterfront, and you show everyone just how powerful your roar is and just how beautiful you are capable of being. Because sometimes we don't hear it enough, so I'm going to say it again. You best believe it. You are beautiful. And until next week, bye-bye. And remember that some are born to move the world, to live their fantasies.